On the 16th of December, 1947, two scientists at Bell Labs, John Bardeen and Walter Brattain, conducted an experiment. They connected a strip of gold foil with a small piece of semiconductor and a bent paperclip. And if they wiggled this device in just the right way, then they could amplify a signal. Not only that, they could also turn a signal on or off. That evening, on the car ride home, Brattain told his colleagues that he had just done the most important experiment that I'd ever do in my life. This marked the end of a 2-year-long journey Brattain and Bardeen had been on to solve one of the biggest problems of the time: find a replacement for the vacuum tube. This video is partially based on the book The Power Law by Sebastian Mallaby. I could not recommend the book enough, and we've put a link in the description. At the time, vacuum tubes were the basic building blocks of computers. That's because they could turn a signal on or off. When a signal's off, it encodes a 0, and when it's on, it encodes a 1. This is the basic idea of a bit. And if you then connect different vacuum tubes together, then you can encode more and more information. For example, 10001 could encode 17. And while the most powerful computer at the time, the ENIAC, was made of around 20,000 vacuum tubes still had some major flaws. They were large, they were fragile, they were unreliable, and they were extremely expensive. The ENIAC cost a whopping $487,000, or around $8.5 million in today's money. And as a result, computers were only used by the military, big corporations, and research institutions. But if anyone could find a replacement for the vacuum tube, one that's cheaper, more reliable, easier to make, and, well, smaller, well then computers stood a chance to be used by everyone. And Brattain and Bardeen had just found a potential replacement. They called this invention the transistor.
The question in everyone's mind at the time was, could it be made into a thoroughly practical device? Or was it merely an erratic laboratory curiosity?
After finding out about their invention, their boss, a man named William Shockley, also wanted part of the credits, so he devised another way to make the transistor, one which turned out to be easier to fabricate and more reliable. And so, for their contributions, the three got the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1956. But while they discovered an invention that would literally change the world, Bell Labs actually didn't do too much with it to turn it into a commercial product. For transistors to become ubiquitous, someone would have to take this invention and find a way to manufacture tens, hundreds, or many thousands of them. That same year, that's exactly what Shockley set out to do. He quit his job at Bell Labs and moved to the west coast of the United States to found Shockley Semiconductor, where he would focus on making silicon-based transistors. And with it, he brought silicon to the valley for the very first time. Now, Shockley had become a bit of a celebrity. One of his employees later said that getting a call from him was like picking up the phone and talking to God. And Shockley used his reputation to build a team of all-star engineers and researchers. If anyone was going to change the world with this semiconductor technology, it was destined to be William Shockley. But Shockley had a fatal flaw. He was a terrible boss. He was known for his bad temper and ruling with an iron fist. One of his researchers later said, "I don't think tyrant begins to encapsulate Shockley." This temper got the better of him when he got a visit by his financier, Arnold Beckman. Beckman had invested in Shockley because he expected rapid growth and profits. But Shockley hadn't delivered. And so now Beckman came around to demand better results. This infuriated Shockley, who yelled, "If you don't like what we're doing up here, I can take this group and get support anyplace else," and stormed off. 7 of Shockley's researchers witnessed this conflict. But they disagreed. They had enough of Shockley and his outbursts, so they called up Beckman to ask him to release Shockley of his managerial duties. At first, Beckman agreed, but a few days later, he changed his mind. See, Shockley might be a tyrant, but in the words of Sebastian Mallaby, he was a Nobel Prize-winning tyrant after all. So the researchers faced a choice. Do as Beckman said and make peace, or find another job. Now, getting a new job would be easy. Each one of them was extremely talented and well respected within the field. In other words, they were the best scientists around and trying to change the world by finding a way to commercialize the transistor. And they knew that their chances of achieving this were the best if they stuck together. Plus, they had an idea. Eugene Kleiner's father had a connection to an investment firm in New York. So they wrote him a letter asking to be hired by a company which can supply good management. This letter was received by a 31-year-old investor named Arthur Rock. And Rock was the perfect person to receive this letter. Just 2 years earlier, he had led a funding package for General Transistor, who were the first commercial maker of germanium transistors. And so Rock was familiar with the industry. And also with Shockley's godlike status. Which made Rock realize that because Shockley had hired these people, the researchers must be on top of their field. And since they're working on cutting-edge technology, it's a no-brainer for a commercial opportunity. But Rock also noticed something else. The fact that these 7 youngsters were on the point of mutiny signaled that they didn't just have the credentials. They also had character. In June of 1957, Rock met the group of rebels in San Francisco for dinner, where he told them an option they hadn't considered yet. The way you do this is you start your own company. That way they could rule themselves and keep the fruits of their own labor. The researchers were blown away. It was an option they hadn't considered at all. But with Rock's promise of a $1 million funding package, the researchers were in. There was just one problem. Rock didn't have the money. So Rock quickly approached different potential investors, but 10 rejections turned into 20, which turned into 35. Then, one of his colleagues suggested an unlikely investor, Sherman Fairchild. Fairchild was in his 60s, had inherited great wealth, and according to Fortune, wore a fresh pretty girl every few days like a new boutonniere. But he was also a fan of science. So 2 of the researchers, Robert Noyce and Eugene Kleiner, went over to Fairchild's Manhattan house, where Noyce explained how the future would be built on tiny silicon devices made of metal and sand, materials that cost basically nothing. The company that could make transistors out of these materials and replace the vacuum tube would stand to make millions, and Fairchild could be the visionary to back it. Fairchild was sold, and he would get the company named in his honor. The researchers, in turn, would each buy 100 shares for $500, giving them around 10% of the company each. Rock's firm bought 225 shares at the same price, summing up to a total investment of just $5,125. Fairchild, on the other hand, would give a loan of $1.4 million. Now, this seemed like a spectacular deal for the rebels, but there was a catch. The loan came with an option to buy the entire company for $3 million. But the group had no other realistic options. It was this loan or no company. So they abandoned Shockley and founded Fairchild Semiconductor. In doing so, they became known as the Traitorous Eight. With their new freedom, they rapidly started testing new combinations of metals and semiconductors, along with all kinds of other experiments that Shockley would have never allowed. But what made the group really stand out is that they would talk to customers to understand which products would actually be valuable so that their equity would go up. And a year later, in 1958, they had made their first sale. 100 transistors to IBM for $150 a piece. Now, making a single transistor cost them around 3 cents in materials and about another 10 cents in labor. In other words, they had just sold 100 transistors for $15,000 and it cost them only $13 to make. I mean, I've never heard of a better business than this. It's like you take sand and you take metal, you fashion them together a little bit, which is basically free, and then you just print money. But their biggest breakthroughs were yet to come. The following year, they figured out that you can make and connect several tiny transistors directly onto a single chip. They had just invented the integrated circuit, or the microchip. That same year, the company raked in $6.5 million in revenue for an astonishing $2 million in after-tax profits. So Rock had done it. He had liberated talent from a place that didn't value and appreciate it and turned it into a wildly successful company. This move would be repeated over and over again by later venture capitalists, and in doing so, spawned some of the world's biggest technological and commercial breakthroughs. But at Fairchild, the success came at a price. The company was doing so well that Sherman Fairchild exercised his option to buy the entire company for $3 million. This left Rock's firm with a spectacular 600 times return. And the founding 8 were left with a total of $2.4 million. But on an open market, the company was probably worth around $100 million. So the biggest winner by far was Sherman Fairchild. And Rock realized his mistake. He realized that he let the passive investor walk away with most of the profits. But he also learned that this method of investing had potential. It showed how you could invest a small sum of money to liberate brainpower and then create technological breakthroughs, which then resulted in this bonanza-style return, which can make fortunes. And so, a few years later, in 1961, Rock used this lesson to start his own $3.4 million venture capital fund, together with Tommy Davis. They would use this money to make a few high-risk bets in startups, and they would wind up their fund after 7 years. And because they had seen how powerful the equity culture was at Fairchild, they made sure that for all their investments, the key employees and the founders were owners. So the founders typically kept around 45% of the company, another 10% went to key employees, and then the remaining 45% would go to Davis and Rock's firm. When Davis and Rock wound up their fund 7 years later, their $3.4 million was now worth around $77 million, for a mind-boggling 56% annualized return, far outdoing the likes of Warren Buffett, who historically has had an annualized return of around 22%, although he did do it for mind-boggling periods of time. But more astonishing than these returns is that $60 million of it came from just a single $257,000 bet in a computer maker known as Scientific Data Systems. It's a bonanza of a 233 times return that single-handedly carried the returns of Davis and Rock's partnership. And this, as we'll see, is a common theme. And it hints towards a hidden law that governs all of venture capital. See, venture capital works vastly different from anything else in ordinary life. Because in life, many things are normally distributed. For example, the average American is 177 centimeters tall, and 2/3 of all Americans fall within 7.5 centimeters of that average. The odds that you find someone who's 30 centimeters away from that average are about 0.01%. And as you go further out, the odds quickly drop to 0. But not all phenomena follow this distribution. If instead you look at the wealth of Americans, you find that it looks vastly different. People who are richer can sometimes be significantly richer. So you get these extended fat tails. And because the very wealthy are numerous and rich enough, they can affect the average of the nation as a whole. And that pulls the average to the right. Now, in a normal distribution, the mean is also the most common occurrence. But in skewed distributions like this one, that is not the case. The average is significantly higher than the median. But perhaps more importantly, when you're in a normal distribution, you can remove outliers and it won't affect the average much. If a 213 centimeters tall NBA star leaves a bus of 100 men, then the average height of the remaining men falls from 177 centimeters to perhaps something like 176 centimeters. But in skewed distributions, the outliers can have spectacular effects. If Elon Musk hops off that same bus, well, then the average wealth of those left behind drops from something like $4 billion to just a few $100,000. Distributions like this are sometimes called the 80-20 rule, or Pareto's principle, where 80% of the wealth belongs to 20% of the people, or how for businesses, 80% of the revenue comes from 20% of the customers. Now, there is nothing special about the numbers 80 and 20. It could be that 95% of the profits come from just 5% of the customers. The main key is that they are all examples of the same thing, the power law. The power law is what you get when those who win keep winning at an accelerated pace. And this is exactly what's driving these bonanzas in venture capital. When Fairchild achieved some initial success, it created new opportunities for them, allowing them to grow faster and faster to sort of grow exponentially. Whenever you have outliers where success multiplies success, you switch from the realm of normal distributions to that of the power law. Now, this pattern, where a few bets account for the vast majority of the returns, repeats itself over and over again in venture capital. It's literally the rule that governs everything. Private equity fund Horsley Bridge invested in venture funds that backed 7,000 startups between 1985 and 2014. And out of those, 5% accounted for 60% of all the gains. For Y Combinator, the results were even more extreme. In 2012, they calculated that 75% of their returns came from just 2 out of the 280 startups they bet on. So venture capital is a world that's ruled by bonanzas. As Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, said, "The biggest secret in venture capital is that the best investment in a successful fund equals or outperforms the entire rest of the funds." Because of this power law behavior, venture capitalists need to be ambitious. They need to invest in companies that are by their very nature highly unlikely to succeed. But if they do, well, then they change the world and create astonishing returns. The year after the wild success of the Davis and Rock partnership, in 1969, $171 million went into venture capital, fully 50 times what Davis and Rock had started with. And thus, the venture capital revolution had begun. But around the same time that Davis and Rock started their fund and started this whole venture capital revolution, there was also another major important driver for technological progress.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner. It's a report from man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik.
On the 4th of October 1957, the Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite, the Sputnik 1. This shocked the Americans. Since the Second World War, they believed that they had the technological advantage. And yet now, the Soviets were clearly ahead.
Let's start telling the truth. And let's face the fact that we've taken a licking, psychologically at least, and scientifically. And it has embarrassed us throughout the world.
It also led to a seemingly logical, yet terrifying conclusion. If they could use a rocket to get Sputnik into space, then it would only be a matter of time before they used those same rockets to launch nukes to America. Edward Teller, the developer of the hydrogen bomb, said that the United States had just lost a battle more important and greater than Pearl Harbor. In response, President Dwight Eisenhower raised money to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, the most powerful of which were the Minutemen. Several years later, President John F. Kennedy set yet another audacious goal for the United States.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
For both of these projects to succeed, they required computers that could fit inside the nose cones of rockets. In other words, they needed small and powerful computers, which could only be achieved by microchips. So this created a constant and high demand for the most advanced microchips.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
As a result, the average price quickly dropped. In 1962, the price for a Minuteman missile microchip was $50, and 6 years later, it had dropped to just $2. See, that was the pattern for electronics. Every year they got smaller, cheaper, and more powerful. In 1965, Gordon Moore published a paper called Cramming More Components onto Integrated Circuits, a very beautiful creative name. And in it, he described the phenomena. He wrote, "Integrated circuits will lead to such wonders as home computers, automatic controls for automobiles, and personal portable communications equipment. The electronic wristwatch needs only a display to be feasible today." Which he then followed with a prescient prediction. The complexity for minimum component costs has increased at a rate of roughly a factor 2 per year. And there is no reason to believe it will not remain nearly constant for at least 10 years. Now, what this means is that so far, the number of transistors have been doubling every year, while keeping the cost for the entire chip the same. And Moore expected that this trend would continue for the next 10 years. This has become known as Moore's Law. In 1975, it was revised to a doubling every 2 years instead of every 1 year. But remarkably enough, until today, this prediction has mostly held up. In part, that's because Moore's Law actually became a goal for the industry, so it's sort of become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the big takeaway is this. Roughly every 2 years, the performance of a chip doubles for the same price. Or if instead you want to keep the performance the same, well then the price for that same chip will halve every 2 years. This kind of exponential improvement makes it very powerful for new companies and new technologies to emerge. And one of the companies that benefited significantly from Moore's Law was Fairchild Semiconductor. By 1966, profits had grown to $12 million. But inside the company, things weren't looking great. Ever since the founders lost their stock, the magic in the company started to fade. One of the Trader's 8 said that it felt like just another employee working in a research lab for somebody else. This made many employees leave the company for others where they did get stuck. And by 1968, the company had lost many key employees and it was hemorrhaging money. Noyce turned to Gordon Moore, who was one of the 3 remaining of the Trader's 8 at Fairchild, and said, "I'm thinking of leaving." Noyce called up Rock and told him that he was quitting to start a new firm. "What took you so long?" Rock replied. A few weeks later, Noyce and Moore quit Fairchild to start a new company that would focus on building integrated circuits. They weren't entirely sure what to name their new company. They considered NM Electronics after their initials, or perhaps something like Electronic Solid State Computer Technology Corporation, but none of these sounded too exciting. Eventually, they decided on Integrated Electronics Corporation. Still not great, but it did have the advantage that it could be shortened to Intel. And so in 1968, Intel was born. Noyce and Moore each bought 245,000 shares for $245,000, and Rock bought 10,000 shares at the same price. The outside investors would get 500,000 shares, but at a price of $5 a share. Another pot of shares was set aside for employees. Only with Intel, all employees got shares. A year after Intel was founded, one of their employees, a guy named Ted Hoff, realized that people were being wasteful and inefficient by designing different microchips for different purposes. Instead, Intel could create a single, general-purpose chip that could be programmed to do just about anything. And a few months later, they had designed this general-purpose chip, which came to be known as a microprocessor. Intel realized that these microprocessors could be programmed to perform just about any logical function, and thus they would become a standard component in electrical devices.
Probably every one of you has been affected by it. It's turning up everywhere, and it's going to keep on turning up everywhere, and our chance of a better quality of life depends essentially on this little thing.
In 1971, Intel revealed the first microprocessor to the world, the Intel 4004. It cost $200 and orders started pouring in. Noyce became one of the biggest advocates of the microprocessor, and in 1972, during a family reunion, he stood up while holding a wafer above his head and said, "This is going to change the world. It's going to revolutionize your home. In your own house, you'll all have computers. You will have access to all sorts of information. You won't need money anymore. Everything will happen electronically." Noyce's prophecy turned out to be remarkably accurate. As Moore's law predicted, microprocessors became more powerful, smaller, and cheaper each year. So, by the 1970s, it was only logical that the next step would be home computers. Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center called the personal computer an idea whose time had arrived. But none of the leading computer companies, like Intel, National Semiconductor, Xerox, or HP, wanted to make a PC. Xerox was scared that it would harm its photocopying business, and HP in turn was afraid to hurt its sales of their expensive premium systems, which were selling for around $150,000. So when a young engineer offered them designs for a PC, they rejected him not once, but twice. This rejection turned out alright though. The young engineer shared the design with a friend of his called Steve, and together they decided to launch a company that would build personal computers. In 1976, the pair founded Apple. Apple would work on cutting-edge technology and seemed to fill a clear gap in the market, with the potential for some outstanding returns. So you'd expect that they'd have venture capital firms all over them, begging to invest. But that was not the case. When Jobs tried to raise money, they were faced with rejection after rejection. Jobs offered Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari, to buy 1/3 of Apple for $50,000. But Bushnell declined. He later reflected, "I was so smart, I said no. It's kind of fun to think about that when I'm not crying." Still, Jobs kept pressing on, and he wanted Apple's marketing to be done by Regis McKenna, who also ran the marketing for Intel. So he offered Regis 20% of Apple in return for doing Apple's commercials. McKenna said that 20% of nothing is still nothing, and so he too declined. But both Bushnell and McKenna softened the blow by referring Jobs to someone else. And that someone was Don Valentine.
Without exaggeration, I would say that every meeting with Steve was a showstopper.
Valentine had risen through the ranks at Fairchild Semiconductor and was now running his own successful venture fund, Sequoia. Valentine invested in Apple but wanted to hire an experienced manager to help build it. Jobs agreed, and they soon hired Mike Markkula. Markkula used to work at Intel, and after his stock options took off, he retired at age 33. Now, 18 months later, he went to visit the two Steves. Markkula was impressed by the Apple II prototype. This was one elegant, beautifully crafted design that was done, and I'm a circuit designer, I know. he said. Markula was in and invested $91,000 of his own money for 26% of the company, making him arguably the first angel investor in the Valley. And with Markula on board, the company quickly hired other stars and executives by replicating Intel's stock option plan.
Once we had an investment, that's when Steve's personality changed, and he was going to be businessman.
The equity culture had now firmly taken hold of Apple, and Apple was taking off. And 3 years later, Apple went public. By the end of December 1980, it was valued at $1.8 billion, which made it another incredible bonanza. But over the years, Apple's valuation just kept shooting up and up. And nowadays, it's worth around $3.4 trillion. Now, due to bonanzas like these, venture capital was becoming unstoppable. Annual return rates of 30 to 50% were common, and so money started to flood into venture funds. Between 1973 and 1977, the whole venture industry raised an average of $42 million per year. Between 1978 and 1982, that average had shot up to $940 million per year. With so much money going around, the next round of startups and breakthroughs were just waiting to be funded. Breakthroughs in everything from browsers and search engines to rockets and artificial intelligence. All of it fueled by this machine of venture capital. A machine that was shaken to its very core by the unorthodox move of a single Japanese investor, forever altering the way venture capital worked. But all of that and so much more will have to wait for a second video. So make sure you're subscribed to get notified when that video comes out.